And with Jay Martin here on the 107 stream, we're going to be talking about how has Brexit gone. Is one of the main things that's preoccupying the whole government and a lot of politics at the moment. Could it be devastating for the economy? Might it actually work out? Well, we will see now. Based on what your thoughts are on this, which is how is it going? How is it likely to turn out? Do you think?
What, Brexit in general? Well, I think at the moment, Brexit's, it's about as predictable as butterfly and chaos theory, and about as well managed from the government as a chocolate fire guard. There's been significant developments on Brexit for the past few months, really. And unfortunately, whether you're leave or remain or somewhere in between or have changed your mind, it's one of these, it's almost like Britain has had a really good night out with the EU and at the moment is just beginning its hangover, which is the best way that I've got to sort of explain it. So, yes, I'm going to talk through just some of the developments because there's not a lot by way of media or real explanation as to what different things are, a lot of terms that are being bandied around, what the process is, and of course, I want to touch on some of the, say, impact assessments, some of the regional impact assessments that were published yesterday, that being the 7th of February. And by published, I mean leaked. Mm-hmm. So what I thought I would just start off with is just some key statistics which go back just before the Brexit vote, so of June 2016. We're now in 2018. And that is that the European Union accounts for just around about 30% of global GDP. Its population's around about 510 million, and its largest population is that of Germany with 81 million, to its smallest, which is Malta, with 0.4 million people. It accounts for roughly 7% of the world's population and is the largest economic area on the planet with a GDP of around about 13.15 trillion. Average earnings, this is per capita GDP, is around about 25,500 euros, with average unemployment within the Eurozone of around about 12%, youth unemployment being particularly high, around about 24%. So it's never a good start to start with statistics, but I think that they're relevant. So recently there's certainly a lot of newspaper coverage about the influence of Germany. Well, the reason that Germany is so influential is simply down to its population. And this has caused quite a bit of antagonism previously from member states like Poland, who reckon during the Second World War they lost around about 15% of their population, and have said, well, this is disproportionate, this is Germany's fault. So there's a lot of historic issues within the European Union that haven't really been resolved, that are being played out, if I'm being fair. Britain has a very interesting history with Europe. Britain joined in 1973 next to Ireland, who also joined. But it wasn't quite the European Union that we know today. This is the European community as it was. And there's the idea of Europe has always been to essentially stop conflict. So there's been a proposal of some form of union between countries, normally Britain and France, for at least the past 150 years. So in 1904, you've got what's called the Entente Cordiale, which is an alliance between Britain and France. This then developed in 1940 to a union as proposed by Churchill. After the war, you have again further proposals of Europe becoming a federal state. These were driven by the Tory, Winston Churchill. You have then, by 56, another Tory, Macmillan, who proposes something called Frangleterre, which is a merger between the two countries, Britain and France. They got particularly far ahead, one sticking point being who will be the head of state. The idea is simply being that Europe, because it's been the old world, the place where there's a lot of conflict, that after a second global conflict, and it's probably not fair to say that was the Second World War. Certainly, if you look at some as Queen Anne's War, for example, these are global conflicts. There are plenty of global conflicts involving European powers before the First World War. But it's recognised that the destruction of what we call the First and Second World Wars had to come to some form of end. And removing sort of barriers to trade and removing areas in which countries have gone to war, often based on trade, religion, political differences, and just ancient hostility. The idea was that after the Second World War, that one of the things that can prevent war is trade. So the European Union starts off, its origins are with France, Germany, Italy, the Benelux countries, that's Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, with the European Coal and Steel Board. You need energy, which is coal and steel, to rebuild essentially a flattened continent. So this is where it starts, and a lot of its policies have developed and a lot of its institutions have developed in that way to try and remove conflict. So, excuse me, you have trade that then begins to develop to things that we know about today, the Eurozone. One way to stop currency wars is to have one currency. One way to stop a country out-competing you, for example, in France, where at the time of the working time directive that we're familiar with in this country, France average working hours were around about 30, 35. In Germany, 35, 40. Well, one way to stop countries out competing and therefore conflict and et cetera, is to have a working time directive, is to have something like that. The development of political institutions is also key, so that there's one governing force or one federal system. I don't think Europe will ever become a country in a traditional sense, but certainly a federation. And it's not as if we're not familiar with things like this. If I give you a definition of a series of countries with their own laws sharing a similar currency with a federal structure, I'm not talking about the European Union. I'm talking about the United States of America. So that's where we are. And undoubtedly, when you have some of the largest economies within this club, Britain being one of them, Germany another, it has quite a bit of clout. And our argument really for leaving has been very unusual. There was a referendum in 1976, 3 years after we joined, as to whether or not we should be members. And obviously that referendum was won. But at the time, the Labour Party, the trade union movement, were very uncomfortable with what is a corporatist bloc. The arguments at the time were, well, why would Britain want to join, something that's good for business, and it seems to be very corporate, when Britain has some of the best workers' protections on the planet, as it did at the time. So the left were against us going into Europe. And I think we just need to remember as well, when we say Europe, we are actually talking about a continent. There are plenty of countries in Europe that aren't in the European Union. But again, back to 76, a lot of countries seem to, a lot of conservatives seem to favour the EU because of its trade and because of its business-centric approach, removal of tariffs and barriers to trade, etc., which they favoured. And after the experience of Thatcher, the left began to reconsider its position, realising quite quickly that the only thing that was protecting us from the Tories was actually the European Union.
So that's kind of where we are now, where it's because there were some Lexit arguments, weren't there? Such as Jeremy Corbyn said he was only 7 out of 10, roughly speaking, in favour of staying in, and there was there were still concerns by the left over it. It's a corporate structure. It's fundamentally anti-democratic. It protects corporate interests, sort of thing. Obviously, we have all the rest on the other side about all the rights and protections it gives us and freedoms across the continent. But there was nevertheless still a Lexit argument this time, just as there was in the 70s.
There was, and there's a sort of traditional left resistance to things like this. I mean, when the European Parliament and this idea of voting for your MEP came about, the European Union, as with a lot of other structures from the post-war period, political and economic pluralism, as it's known, often develop themselves into a tripartite nature. So you see it in workplaces where you've got a tripartite system that works within disciplinaries and grievances. So you've got the manager, the person who's being disciplined or the aggrieved, and the union rep, all three integral parts of that process. With the European Union, you've got the European Council, the Commission, the Parliament. Now, the Commission, which the commissioners are appointed by each state. Well, if you've got the people who are voting, in favour of something in a commission that's representative of the people, then it's a 2/3 majority, and the people are usually quite happy. The concern now, and certainly with the sort of Lexit supporters, has been that, the Commission doesn't actually represent the people it's meant to represent. Instead seems to be, along with the Council, for example, this body of unelected peers. Previously one of our commissioners was Peter Mandelson, Dr. Dark or whatever you might want to call him, but there was no Lord Mandelson wasn't elected. So there is a serious democratic deficit within Europe, and perhaps if Britain leaves the European Union, it may reform itself. But I'll come on to some of my thoughts on where it is. I think Europe could be reformed and would fit in with what we need within the UK, because at the moment I don't think there is any clear strategy, and certainly some of the reports from yesterday that have been leaked and then later confirmed by the government on its impact on regions has been very interesting, because there's a disproportional effect on regions that voted to leave the European Union and the effect on their local economies. It's a perverse relationship, if you will.
Such as Cornwall did. Is going to lose a lot of funding, isn't it? And that was a region that voted overall for leave.
Yeah, the famous, rights, we voted to leave, we get $1 billion from the European Union. Will we still have that? And of course, the following day, they were told, well, no, that's one of the things that you've left. European, cities of culture, suddenly finding that they can't be European cities of culture. There's a lot of things that have hit people, but in economic terms, there is a correlation, and please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that people who voted to leave are somehow racist or anything like that, but it is very interesting perceptions. Those areas that voted highest, the North East, for example, to leave the EU, tended to give the reasons that they wanted to leave as being, immigration's out of control. And yet those areas are the areas that have the least levels of immigration. So from Cumbria, where I'm speaking to you from now, the county voted to leave. It's one of the most homogenous regions of the country, and yet is also disproportionately affected. And I think it's mainly down to remnants of industry and those areas where globalization, which, let's face it, I think the reason that the Vote Leave camp won is because of people's general frustrations with globalization. This idea that, corporations seem to be able to skip national laws and national government, don't pay any tax, constantly year on year, weaken workers' rights, and then perpetuate this sort of myth, if you will, which there's very little economic argument for. I'm trying to be as neutral as I can be, but this idea that people come over and undercut wages, well, that would be true if they did, if people who are new into the UK or indeed any country went straight in for managerial jobs and the other sort of jobs that most of the population do. Instead, a lot of immigrants came over to this country, between the accession of Poland, for example, and a lot of the former Eastern Bloc countries back in the mid 2000s. So for example, 2004 was when Poland joined the EU, Lithuania, Latvia, etc., etc. A lot of migrants coming over to this country to do jobs that, frankly, the British people didn't want to do. And where immigrants did integrate into other industries, it wasn't at a necessarily lower rate. But there is some argument that, employers have worsened conditions since then, based upon the old notion that you're less likely to defend your rights if if you don't speak the language. So this is where we are at the moment with Brexit. We're in. It almost feels like 10 years ago since we voted to leave. Very little has actually changed from the UK government side. There is clear, it's very clear that since post-Thatcher, it's not just the left that has changed the view, but also the right, who...
So just before we get into that, we just have a couple of questions just on before we get into what's now happening, which is one of which you were saying, there was combined with Lexit, there was a general stick it to the man feeling about globalization and corporations as well, and these are more sort of wholesome reasons, you would say, though. Now, you could say it's politically incorrect to say that that a lot of the Leave result was driven by racism, but would there be a way of actually finding out the level of xenophobic feeling that would have actually led to what proportion of the Leave vote? Because it must have been quite a high proportion of people who were simply voting to against immigration, against migrants, and that would be something you could measure if you had some sort of survey, which I presume people have tried to do since the result.
Well, I'm a member of the YouGov panel, so when setting questions, it's very difficult to ask people. If you went to ask them what.
Yes, that sort of thing. You can't ask them that, but you can. But to get to the feeling, yes, it's kind of like trying to shine a light on an area. Perhaps people want to keep hidden, but may, a bit like the Shy Tory phenomenon. We don't want to admit that we have certain views, or people don't, and then it gets expressed at the through at the voting booth. So I guess that's what you're going to say about that, perhaps.
Well, where I was going with it is it's very difficult to ask questions about things like, you mentioned the term politically incorrect. Ask questions of people who perceive the answer to be politically incorrect. So if you say you're xenophobic, I would suggest that most people would say no. If you say, is there a problem with immigration? The answer would be yes, but it's then drilling down into specifics. So really, the only thing that we have, the only data that we've got, is from questions that, the problem with xenophobia is the fact that it depends what your beliefs on the definition of xenophobia. Is someone anti-immigrant because they worry about border control, or is someone xenophobic if they want to remove migrants? Well, I know which side I would go down, but again, it's an interpretive issue that just becomes a bit more challenging when you're trying to get information like this, which is relevant and important.
Nevertheless, how far has it actually? Has there been an official sort of, or has there been a sort of an official result or survey that has said, well, has found actually yes, we got this percent that we believe, well, it was kind of driven by xenophobia, a lot of this leave, and this is our survey that supports this, or has that just been too difficult really because of that to ascertain so far?
It's been too difficult to ascertain. I mean, a lot of pollsters suggest that they've got the magic question, but actually, when you go to look at the questions that they've asked, there's a few problems with it. There is plenty of survey data where people have been asked, immigration is out of control. Now, you might think that's a fair question. It's a very loaded question because you're forcing the person to answer it about out of control, etc. Now, there's a lot of data around questions like that, which do tend to support the belief that those areas that voted to leave tended to give the reasons for voting to leave because of a perception that the European Union removes borders, which again is incorrect. But this has been, a part of Tory and the right-wing strategy to demonise Europe since we started. A ever more vocal minority, now a majority of people within the right-wing parties, UKIP, even the Labour Party, have tended to suggest, well, it's become some workers' paradise, and all of this, and there's no control of the borders, and there's nothing like that. That's been a 43-year, 42-year campaign, really, to demonise the European Union. The reality is, well, those areas that tended to perceive immigration as an issue, as I say, tend to be more homogenous. And of course, the key argument is, well, if we didn't control our borders, how do you explain the Sangat refugee camp in Calais? So there was certainly interesting arguments there. At the moment, I don't. Many people within the union movement have very mixed views and are quite honest about it. Actually, I have to say. Compared to a lot of people I've spoke to in the broader public, there's a lot of people who said, "Well, I voted to leave, but given the chance, now I've read up about it, I'd vote Remain."
So it seems that even Nigel Farage seemed to change his view a little bit there, didn't he? On that Moment on the Right stuff a couple of weeks ago, where he seemed to sort of hint at something where maybe we should have a second referendum or something, which is kind of showing it's kind of like a BrExit or something slightly there, even from him. That kind of strange, wasn't it?
Well, not really. If you look at Nigel Farage, and I will say the word Farage because he wouldn't want me to say it with a continental twist. Farage, would he?
We could do that, couldn't we, for a joke? Farage. You don't want to be... Oh, we're out the EU now, so you better start calling me Farage. Please.
That's it.
Right.
Well, if you look at his character, he thrives on controversy. So his character is very much, I want another referendum because have a guess who's going to be in the limelight, plenty of invoices coming in, etc. I don't wholly think a second referendum's a bad idea, but not in this country, which is an odd thing to say. There are some countries that are used to referenda. Switzerland have them every Sunday, near enough. Britain, we tend not to. The only real period of plebiscites, referenda, was sort of between the First and Second World War. We tend not to do things.
There you go.
Hello.
Wasn't sure about that. Just seemed to drop.
Yep.
So there you
Ready to go again?
Yeah, absolutely.
We tend not to do things by referenda in this country. Instead, we have a belief of sort of good government. Government should be we go to the polls for them to make decisions. And actually, the introduction of referenda, sort of dating back to the alternative vote referenda, has actually returned very unstable government. We had a coalition that had to sign in a fixed-term Parliament Act in order to keep itself going. It did so because it knew if it didn't have some mechanism to force it together, it'd collapse. We then have the return of a Tory government that, whilst had a majority of, 13, something along those lines, was inherently unstable because we had the issue of Europe tearing the Tories apart. Then we've had we've had a series of referenda every year, it seems, where there's been some crucial question, which has then led to BrExit, the collapse of government, a gamble in elections, another election, which has returned, a hung parliament. Which, let's be honest about it, we don't have a government. We don't have a Queen's Speech, which, I'm a Republican before any of your listeners wonder. But, Queen's Speech sets out the government's agenda. We don't have one this year. In fact, we're not going to have one for a 2-year period. So the agenda is dominated by BrExit from a government that doesn't really know if it can get things through Parliament, that has, resorted to Henry VIII powers. I mean, we're talking dictatorial powers, autocratic powers, to get legislation through, that seems to sidestep democracy at every turn. And whether it's sheer incompetence or whether it's deliberate misinformation, they don't appear to be willing to share information that, at the very least, our lawmakers, our MPs, need to make an informed decision. And that, extends to the public. The number of people who have said, and I firmly believe, vote, leave or remain, you were lied to. There wasn't an honest debate. Information was kept behind closed doors. So when we have these impact assessments that, are being leaked, there is a huge question as to why on earth wasn't this done for all sides before the referendum? So, in a nutshell, we're not used to referenda in this country. We might be becoming used to, but we ask simple questions. We ask questions like, should we remain part of the European Union? Well, does that mean the customs union? Does that mean free trade area? Does that mean, does it mean the European Court of Human Rights? Does it mean, we don't know is the answer to that because, no government can interpret the result because that wasn't the question on the paper.
Wow.
In fact, the question on the paper was, a little bit too singular, if you will.
You would have thought it would be seen in such a simple way as withdraw from everything to do with the European Union and institutions. yes or no and be quite binary. But you're saying actually there's all this complexity about exactly what we could withdraw from and how we can do it. So that can get us onto what this bit now, which is how are they now managing to do it to remove from all these institutions and renegotiate, especially
Well,
in this
what
situation now with the mess that they're in with half a government really.
Yeah, well, what I think would be useful is for us to go through the different economic forms that we're integrated into the European Union. So this might be useful if any of your listeners are, watching the news and hearing all of these terms. I'm just going to break them down as simply as I can do. The first one you might have heard of is what's called a PTA, or this is a preferential trading area or a preferential trading agreement. So this is often deployed from the United States. They're our preferred trading partner. You might think that that's the special relationship that we have, but it can mean, South Korea or whomever. So we've got a preferential trading area agreement, should say, with Canada, for example. The next form of integration is a free trade area, which is where barriers within a group of countries are essentially broken down. So there's no tariffs within that free trade area. So a tariff is essentially a form of taxation. The country, perversely, back in the 1900s, was tearing itself apart about tariffs as to whether it should have protectionism within the empire or break down barriers to trade. And the barriers often present themselves as some form of tariff. So if you purchase something, I don't know, in China, for example, you might find yourself having to pay a little bit extra, import costs, that kind of stuff. The next part is the customs union. So there's been a hell of a lot of conversation around the customs union. Should we be in it? Leave? All this is a customs union is simply a free trade area plus a common external tariff, or a CET. So a common external tariff would be where if you have a group of countries, free trade between them, no barriers, so you can exchange goods without any taxation. You might have a common VAT policy, for example. But if that group of countries decides it wants to trade with the US or South Korea, mention them, that there is an agreement that between all those countries that they will apply a common external tariff of, 5% or, whatever the group believes. So that's the customs union. The fourth is that of a single market. So all the single market is essentially it's built around there is a single, as it says on the tin, there is a market for all of the countries. It includes your preferential trading areas, free trade areas, your customs union, plus your external tariff. So all of those four areas combined are what we refer to as a single market. So you can have a preferential trading area without a free trade area, for example. So it's all of those previous four that I've mentioned. You've then got the fifth, which is a monetary union, which is where there is a common currency. There's one policy rate, a central bank, etc. Now, the single market, not only does it extend on the previous four that I've mentioned, but also upon what the European Union defines as the four key freedoms. And the four key freedoms are free trading goods. So this is where business can sell products anywhere in the EU. Consumers can buy them without any penalty. So again, that's tariff-free. Mobility of labour is the second. So that citizens of any EU member state can live, study, work, move, holiday without any barriers again. So again, going back to the origins of the EU, this is the aim that you improve mobility of labour, so eventually rights, standards, pay eventually homogenises across the single market. The third is the free movement of capital. So currencies, capital can flow freely even between member states. EU citizens can use financial services in any state, again without restriction. And the last one is the so-called TISA, which just stands for Trade and Services Agreements, but the EU defines the fourth as free trade and services. This is professional services, pensions, architecture, telecoms, that sort of stuff, can be offered again for free in any member state. So in order to remain within the single market, we would have to accept those four key freedoms. Now, you'll notice that the freedoms, and this is where the sort of Lexit arguments come from, those freedoms, well, I only really identified that there's one that has any direct benefit to workers, and that's mobility of labour. Now, the idea that you can, if you wanted to, move to another member state, but again, that comes down to can you afford it, etc., etc. The rest are focused upon the corporate world, trading goods, capital, services.
But there's also 48-hour limit, isn't there? I presume that's something that could come into question. 48 hours a week limit.
Yeah. Well, again, that would come under one of the freedoms. But essentially, what you have is, if you don't want to be in the single market, you're a member of the a free trade area, essentially, because you can't be in the customs union without accepting the four freedoms. So this isn't explained, I don't think. I certainly don't feel or hear it explained to people about what these freedoms are and how they directly affect us. So when we're told, there's economic disaster coming, well, yeah, there is. It's not Project Fair, but we haven't left the European Union, and our currency has taken a complete dive. The 3 out of the 4 freedoms, it is argued from very pro-Remainers that actually they all indirectly benefit workers because it's better jobs, but it's not like other trading agreements like NAFTA, which has seen hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in Mexico and other places. What they argue is, yes, but there are protections for workers that come from Europe, and that really is something that distinguishes us from other free trade zones. So, when you look at some of the advantages of being in the EU, there's easier access for what's called foreign direct investment. So you'll have noticed that the nuclear power stations are being built by the French government through EDF. And yes, there's support from other countries outside of the European Union, but it's easier for other countries to capitalise. And of course, my criticism of anyone who says that the railways were privatised, I hasten to remind them, no, they weren't. They were renationalised by Major and then Blair. They were renationalised just to other countries. Our train lines are run by the Dutch, German and French states, by and large, with Virgin hoovering up, whatever else. You've got access to structural funds, so, improving infrastructure, for example, huge building projects. The city centre of Manchester, for example, was rebuilt on European funding. You've got, trading areas between cities. You've got, you've got all of this. So, what's called interregional trade would be one of them. So, before we sort of move on to where we are now, I'm just going to just give you a bit of a breakdown in the BrExit result, if you will, and just some of those areas that voted by and large to leave. So Scotland, 62%, Northern Ireland, 55.8%, London, 59.9% voted to remain. The highest area in Britain was in England, was the West Midlands, who voted to leave by 59.3%, followed by the East Midlands, the North East. So you've got nearly 60% of the population voting to leave. And these are areas where, there really is a bit of a anomaly, because those tend to be the areas that have received the most by way of EU funding for building projects, other bits of investment. So, where we are at the moment is we've sort of made a decision, and we're now beginning to unpick. What is it that we're going to lose? So I've just very briefly, just some points that people are beginning to sort of think about. Maybe EU regulations. The Tories have put all of the EU regulations into one big, they're calling it the Great Repeal Bill. And it gives you a clue as to what they're going to do when we leave with all of that regulation. They tend not to hide these things.
Yeah.
There will be, and if there are people who are listening to this thinking, well, I voted to leave and I'm proud. I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm trying to, I'm not here to educate. I'm here to provoke thought. There will be. This is not fair. I'm trying to be as balanced as possible. There will be higher levels in terms of cost of intra-EU trade. Now, yes, that will affect the EU as much as it will affect Britain. Well, actually, it will probably affect Britain a lot more, because the EU is a much bigger economy than Britain. So there are going to be higher costs. There is, just because, it'd be very easy to somehow, with some sort of magical power, detach Britain from Europe and sail it into the mid-Atlantic, where, historically Britain's always felt it belongs. Unfortunately, geography doesn't allow you to do things like that, or fortunately, I might argue. Because of the geography, we are connected to it. We have a trade, we have a tunnel that connects us to Europe. We have ferries. We have all of this, and again, sectors such as transport are going to be affected, because there's going to be increased queues at borders now, namely France, Belgium, the Netherlands, maybe, for us. Just wanting to go on holiday or exchange goods, but I'll talk about that in just a second. You've got environmental policies, and the key concern for me is that of employment, wages, and living standards. There are a lot of problems with the EU. But it is an economic union. It's not. It's not there for. It's trying to find its feet, if you will. So when we're looking at the areas that have, potentially been most affected under this report yesterday, we are seeing the North East potentially losing 16% of its economy over 15 years. So if you think that the period of austerity imposed by the Tories and the Liberals, and the Tories again, on the economy has been a lost generation. Well, unfortunately, and yes, they're not quite worst case scenarios, but I think they're in the ballpark. Yes, it's not just going to be a generation. It's going to be, at least 10, 20 years. The reason for this is because the government it's comprised of people who want to remain, the likes of Anna Soubry, who quite happy within the European Union. Thank you very much. It allows us to exploit workers, just not as much as we might, and there we go. You've then got this sort of middling sort, if you will, of people who quite like the idea of the customs union, but if we can trade without the workers' rights, that would be what they would want. You've then got the... Sorry, say that again?
No, I didn't say anything.
Oh, sorry, it must have been feedback. You've then got the sort of far right wing, who some I'm not actually convinced that they believe what they say. For example, Boris Johnson, who just wants to sever ties with Europe completely, sort the consequences. There we go. So. That's and there's then sub-factions of all of that. So you've got Anna Soubry's leading, between 16 and 19 so-called rebels, who all have their own political allegiances, but I get the sense that they tend to think of themselves as a government in waiting. You've then got this sort of customs union people, in the... when I say the middle, I don't mean the political middle, who have differing loyalties, tend to focus a little more on a domestic agenda and are very unhappy with Theresa May. And then you've got a huge bulk, quite a vocal minority within that party of people who just want us to leave completely, who've got loyalties ranging from Jacob Rees-Mogg to Johnson to Gove, but are all unified on one thing, which is Brexit. So really, if you just take a step back and look at Britain, not only are we a laughing stock to most of the planet, but not quite as much as a laughing stock as the United States. But we've made a decision to leave. We've claimed that we're committed to negotiate, but fundamentally, we don't know what we're negotiating on. We don't know which one of the 5 areas, economic agreements, I should say, that we want. Do we want a monetary union? Well, no. The answer is clearly not. We're not in the euro. Oddly enough, it might be the best time to join, but we've said no to that. But we are in the customs union. We are in the European Union. That is to say, the European Union is not just economic. There are political elements to it. There are. You used to vote for your MEP. We used to have directives. And one of the biggest problems with this sort of uncertainty of what it is that we actually want stems down to an obsession by the Tories to remove us from the European Court of Human Rights, which has nothing to do with the European Union. The only possible link with the European Union is that you have to be a member of this, which arbitrates your human rights. If they can be taken away by Theresa May, were they ever rights or just temporary privileges? But secondly, this other obsession, which is of the Tories know best on all matters. Like I say, we're a laughing stock because we're turning up every month for a day to negotiate something that we're completely uncertain of. And well, you've got a government that isn't functioning. So with this, we're in a period of political paralysis. The only thing that is keeping Theresa May in her position is the factions are so split within the Conservative Party. I actually don't think there's a way for them to recover. We're watching a party whose membership's collapsed. The right, who are trying to figure out, which parties, extreme enough for them. And Labour's strategy is very good. It's just to sit and watch it all from the sidelines. Now, my solution to all of this is really simple. I think Europe or the EU are going to become increasingly concerned about separatist movements. And I think we'll become somewhat distracted by the severe lack of progress in BrExit talks, to the point where I get the feeling that most on the negotiating team from the EU side really don't care anymore as to whether or not we leave with or without a deal. But my solution would be very simple. Britain should offer it to remain on the simple conditions, only two of them, possibly a third. The first one is that the European Commission or the Council is abolished and all of their powers brought into the European Parliament. That democratises overnight the entire EU. Secondly...
Yes, go on. I was going to say that that would be a second referendum. Any changes to that would just be a second referendum, wouldn't it? To go back to whether to try go back on different terms. That's what they're arguing for. We could go back on different terms, revised terms. So that would be a second referendum.
I don't think that a second referendum is necessary, to be fair. Just briefly, my second suggestion would be that of, a slight tweaking to movement of labour from free movement of labour to fair movement of labour. That would then incorporate, things like modern slavery, other freedoms that, do have an effect on economies, maybe a bolstering of a EU-wide minimum wage.
Would it cover the wages paid as well? Which is, it's almost going down into slavery, isn't it? But the idea that you get people from, say, the Eastern Bloc, etc., who are willing to work for very low wages, and they're getting exploited. But it's and then some people are saying, oh, it's undercutting local workforce, but it's often, as you said, the jobs that a lot of people don't want to do. So would that presumably would be covered under the fair movement rather than just simply free movement of labour?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think anyone would have any issue when we're talking about movement of labour. I think we have to just bear in mind you've got, is movement of labour really people who are holidaying? My answer would be no. Is movement of labour those who are transporting goods, that are operating under a similar, like I say, a trading area that has the same rules and what have you? Well, no. Movement of labour, what we're talking about is economic migration. Very little evidence as well for people coming to the UK and claiming benefits, by the way. There's billions, I think the last figure was something in the region of 23 billion of benefits are unclaimed, something like that. Very little evidence that people move to countries to go and claim benefits or health tourism. As you know, I've just spent over a week in an emergency assessment unit, and I'm speaking to some of the nurses and doctors, and I said, I tell you what, I'm not sure that I won't name the hospital that I'm in. I said, with the food and the treatment, I'm not sure that I'd like to come on holiday to a hospital. that quickly. There's a nonsense about this tourism, and frankly, if we can afford it as a country, the $500 million that's apparently lost for health tourism, then I'm all in favour of helping people. The third, and again, this is a tweak, would be a change to state aid rules. That there is a perception that you can't renationalise. So I would introduce, or I would argue that countries should renationalise, and any renationalisation is exempted from free trade agreements, specific clauses, which are called investor-state dispute settlements, which enable corporations to sue national governments.
Yeah. Such as
Do you
the
know what?
TTIP, the TTIP, yes, is one that might have brought that in. And Jeremy Corbyn, he would be very happy with that as well, because he would want to, under a Labour government in waiting, he wants to renationalise the railways, for example. So,
well, I think for the left, what it does is we talk about democracy. It gives European citizens a vote. I, for one, don't. I for one believe it's illegal under the UN, ILO, European Court of Human Rights, British legislation, English legislation, notwithstanding a series of treaties for anyone's citizenship to be removed. And yet, that appears to be the direction that we're headed in. Now, the consequences of us leaving really can't be sort of expressed any further than we don't know where we're headed with it. There are schools of thought that think we need a second referendum. I don't think so. I think another election's what's needed. On a very clear platform. No party, not even the Liberals, who were, wanted a party, wanted the last election to be fought on, we'll just stay. It's apparent, I think, if you were to have a question, not a referendum, but a national question, does the European Union need reform? I think you could extend that to the EU, and the answer would be yes, absolutely. I think the people would say it needs to be democratised. As soon as you introduce the vote, that's when the power moves from the boardroom to the ballot box, which is one of the most powerful things that we've invented as a species, in my view. This idea of fair election.
The idea of democracy, which may have begun with ancient Greece, but I suppose you know a lot about that. But one thing that might happen to us is Norway, basically, because they are having to really comply with a lot of EU rules and agreements, but they're outside it. But of course, because they're outside it, like we will be, you can't impact on anything. You just have to accept it. So we have less, and we will still be living under things that perhaps drove some people to vote leave anyway, because we need to trade and follow these rules in order to trade. So is that what we're likely to be seeing? The Norway situation for the UK?
If I'm being blunt about this, Norway, the Canada Plus, Iceland, Switzerland, all of these arguments, South Korea, all of these different countries, we just need to be very blunt about it. Norway has to comply with European legislation, specifically on trade. It has no vote. So it has to comply with all agreements if it trades with the European Union. It's also tied in, where it's very difficult for it to, I think, nigh impossible for it to establish trade with other countries. Norway's economy, its population, its geography is vastly different to Britain's. Its economy is around about 98%, so it's probably too high, but in that ballpark, based upon oil. Back in the 70s, it was based upon fishery. One of the principal reasons for it not joining the EC and then EU has been around things like fisheries, which is another thing that needs to change. But how do you change it unless people have the vote? So the Norway model, well, firstly, it's not just that the country is different, but they don't get a say. Some of the things that Norway has to do are things that, like passport rights. Yes, there are some agreements, but things like financial services have to establish subsidiaries within the EU. Exports, aren't as high as they might be from Norway. You've got things like reductions in legal advice services, that are essentially EU-centric. There's lots of other things. The UK economy is primarily finance and services. There's things like this. I mean, the other, I'll just be blunt about it, but Britain has a competitive advantage because it's a language that's spoke. Not further to the fact that English is the global lingua franca, but by and large, we have quite an advanced civil service. Most of the civil service of the EU are based upon the Brits, if I'm being blunt. I'll just go through briefly then the different models. So Norway's in the European Economic Area. So, what does it? It's not subject to migration controls. It doesn't have any EU budget contributions. Compliance with European rules. Pardon me. It has migration controls, budget contributions, compliance with the EU. It's not free to negotiate with third countries. The other thing it can do is issue its own passports. Joy. It has direct access to the single market, and can, if it wished, put import tariffs on. That's the Norway model. Well, I don't really care about my passport, to be fair. And again, there are considerations with passports that, especially for people who commute between Britain and the continent frequently. For example, those in the civil aviation, who there is a very big worry about whether or not those airlines based in Britain will still be able to actually fly into the European Union if we leave, the so-called hard Brexit. Because, again, it would have to set up subsidiaries and apply for routes, and again, there's issues there. You've got what's called the European Free Trade Area, which is what Switzerland's part of. There are some migration controls that are imposed on it. It's a bit of a open question. It does contribute to the European Union budget. It doesn't comply with all EU legislation, some dependent upon sector. It can negotiate with third parties, other countries, but passporting rights, nope. And access to the single market, nope, but it can put import tariffs. You've got the customs union model, Turkey. So this is, there's migration controls, contribution to the EU budget. It doesn't have to do any of that. It has to comply again with some EU rules, not all of them. It's free to negotiate with third parties, passporting rights, access to the market, can put on import tariffs, and all of that. The EU can apply import tariffs as well. And the last of the options that's been discussed, the World Trade Organization, which essentially it's you're free to do whatever you like, but there are limits upon the tariffs that are based. So all of that might mean very little to people. We've just put it into a bit of a bit of context. Ireland, the Netherlands, we trade as a proportion of GDP, 11.8%, of our trade is in Ireland, 7.6 within the Netherlands, and we invest heavily in those countries. Well, what happens after that? How do you deal with, weaker exchange rates? You lose competitive advantage there. Capital flight, unemployment, all of these real issues. There's a lot of things to just consider, around how it's really going to affect. If I last spoke about this when I was last in work teaching, and I said that just have a look at the English breakfast and the standard components, and I said it's quite difficult really to define which one exactly comes from the UK. If you like your Danish bacon, if you like your pork sausages, usually from Ireland, eggs, usually from Ireland, but can be locally sourced. You've got your beans, which are often again imported. You've got your bread. Yes, that might be from the UK, or you might prefer a continental breakfast. Your croissant. You've got all of these minor issues. You might think minor, but slowly build up. Norway is not an option for us. We, unless what we're saying is, we leave and we're still dictated to. It doesn't matter too much as to what model we have. The European Union is still going to dictate our trade. We presently, about 44 to 48% of our trades with the European Union. Well, if Europe says we need these higher standards, British industry, what's left of it, will have absolutely no choice if it wants to trade with Europe to meet those standards. Otherwise, it's going to have to find other markets, which again, is they might find themselves with higher tariffs. Britain, when it crashes out of the European Union, which is certainly the direction of travel, leaving with no agreement other than World Trade Organization rules, what you will have is a situation that's, Britain's going to take 10, 20 years to sign free trade agreements with other countries and other trading blocs. It's not a quick thing to do. So, like it or not, we are about 20 miles off the coast of the EU. We're connected to it, via the land border in Northern Ireland, or the Channel Tunnel. So we are still going to be affected. My question, I suppose, would be, what's the point of all of this? Mm-hmm. Being dictated to by Brussels, yeah, I agree with the word dictate. There is a democratic deficit. But I thought Britain stood up against adversity, rather than ran away from it. There are issues with Greece and the way that the EU has imposed things. Well, it will do. There's a democratic deficit. That's where it comes down to. It always keeps coming back to. You've then got, sort of elephant in the room, which is the border with Northern Ireland, where, perversely, both sides, there's a huge peace process, but actually, if I'm a Republican in Ireland, I could argue that there is a united Ireland under the European Union. And yes, it's different jurisdictions, but it's as close as, damn it, a united Ireland. If I'm on the other side of this, I could argue, well, actually, we've got British sovereignty still. The UK flag flies over Stormont and all of this. But I can still argue that under the European Union. We're facing the real possibility of customs checks, border checks between the two countries. If, and I hope not to say when that happens, there will be a very quick downward spiral within the province. So there's a lot to consider. And in terms of, domestic policy, well, as I've said, all policy is, and every question is about Brexit. It's not about, improving the health service, which has been deliberately starved. If there's a democratic deficit, I might argue actually, 1/3 of the European Union was at least voted for by, the European population. We've got a government that, doesn't even have 1/3 of our electorate voted for us, and yet is somehow staggering on.
So what do you think they're trying to achieve then in the negotiations? Exactly. So what do they? This even this half government, this the Conservatives propped up by a few DUP. What are they trying to get from it? Do you think?
I honestly, it's not a case of me saying I don't know. I don't think they know. I think they're hoping that something will come out of the wash. There'll be some form of a agreement that's made, and that the EU will essentially give the demands. The real belief is that essentially Britain can trade tariff-free. So this is the solution that satisfies all wings of the Tory. That Britain can trade tariff-free, doesn't have to contribute to the EU budget, won't be subject to any legislation passed in Europe, can keep an open border in Northern Ireland and across the Channel. But the UK border, which is presently in France, stays there. That's the goal. Essentially, that Britain leaves jurisdiction of the EU but keeps all of its benefits. That's the model that they want.
Do you think that's likely to achieve that? I suppose I can guess what you're going to say, but it doesn't. That it isn't. But why isn't it if it isn't?
I was going to say you should try stand-up comedy. If anyone thinks that that's going to happen, well, what would the point of being in the EU be for any EU country? No, it won't happen. The EU is based upon an agreement that, it's corporatist area, it's business friendly, but there are checks on just how far those businesses can go. It's been supremely successful, even in the Balkans later on, in preventing conflict. It's not going to agree to Britain being a member of this, fairy tale, get all of the benefits unless there's some contribution politically or economically. If it were to accept any of those agreements, then it's essentially voted for its own demise, because other countries would say, well, why can't we have that? Europe is going to integrate. If Britain leaves and crashes out, a lot of countries will think, well, the person who's been, the country that's been putting the brakes upon integration has been Britain, and that's, that time's come to an end. Or, I think it genuinely thinks, the EU thinks, we're better with Britain. It has ties with the US, it has ties with other countries, it has a lot to offer in terms of experience, and I think Europe would be very happy if we stopped Brexit. But it can't let, for its own integrity, the UK leave with everything it wants, it's going to make the UK pay and pay above the odds. So that then leaves the government with it's a rudderless ship. No one knows which option it's going to go for. It can't get through Parliament an extreme BrExit where there's, World Trade Organization and everything else is scrapped back onto tariffs. It wouldn't go through Parliament, which is one of the reasons why I think they didn't want it to go through Parliament, and that's to be a court case to force them. It can't get through. It's not really sure if it can even get through a customs union. So yeah, that's what the government strategy is. Essentially, they're hoping something comes up, and when they say that we can't discuss, or we're trying to keep our hand close to our chest, what they're actually saying is we don't know. And if you look at each cabinet meeting is divided. There's very little action that's been taken on certain key points. So there's a cabinet meeting, I think, yesterday, in which Theresa May had important points about the direction of Brexit. When we leave in March 2019, obviously there's a 6-month period beforehand, October of this year. There's questions about when we leave, whether or not during the transition period, whether or not we fall back to being in the customs union. There's lots of questions like that are absolutely fundamental. They are less than a year away. And we still don't know as a country how badly the fall is going to be.
So if it comes to that date and, there hasn't really been much achieved in the negotiation, is that just going to be, could that just be a hard Brexit by default because nothing's been negotiated?
And I think that in part is what a lot of the Tories are hoping for. That they say, it's the European Union's fault for not meeting our demands, and that's the reason that we fell out. So they're hoping for a political get-out clause. That may work for them. It may work for them.
Right, so that's where we are now, more or less, with not much to look forward to necessarily because of just how difficult it is to get any sort of deal with them based on.
Well, I think that Theresa May's days are numbered. They're waiting to see what happens in the local elections before they make it clear. Certainly the 1922 committee, the trade union of the Tory party MPs, have the prerequisite signatures to remove her. I think they're waiting for the elections. But the problem is with any of these Tories, you can remove them from their office, but that doesn't really count. It's removing them from their seat that is the biggest victory. And unfortunately, whilst there's a few scenarios that would trigger the collapse of the government, the Fixed Term Parliament Act prevents no confidence motions. The only thing that I think would remove a government is if a budget fell, and it's not written into law that when the budget falls that the government collapses. Instead, it's just precedent. So, we're heading for. I'm about 70% certain that we're going to crash out of the EU.
That's a good note to which to leave it on, maybe, because we've discussed what it is that they're up against and what it is that the European Union has provided and what it's all about in its various facets. Which it's such a complicated question, isn't it? To a yes or no, we want to be in this or not, because there's all different things as well that it does and ways in which it's tied up. So
Britain as a country does its best when it reforms, when it has that zeal for changing something for the better. Just very briefly before we finish, look at Britain. It was the first industrialised power. Gross exploitation of people around the world. Eventually, it gives up, but it begins to reform itself very quickly. It grants independence within 30, 40 years. Most empires take hundreds of years to fall. It domestically creates the world's first health service based upon the 1944 US Second Bill of Rights, but has the courage to do so without any cash. It creates, Britain, and this is the perverse notion of it all. Britain, after the Second World War, decides that actually we should be arguing for a federation, a European federation, to prevent wars. To people who studied Europe, this is all really unusual, because it's argued by many people that the entirety of the European Union is based upon Britain. Britain was the one that was arguing for it. We established the Supreme Court of Human Rights. Our signature is at the very top. The EU, it was championed by the Conservative Party. All of this is very unusual, and the only thing that I do know is that where Britain runs away from its battles, like appeasement, for example, that's when the worst of us come out. Britain's not an intolerant place, it's becoming less and less tolerant, granted, but by and large it's not an intolerant place. I think a lot of people who voted to leave would probably change their mind now they're in command of a few more facts. Or at least, if they didn't change their mind, I think when they voted this time, they would feel better informed. And again, that's not to say people weren't informed, it's just better. So I think that's the note. I would love for Britain to turn around and say, do you know what, we will reform. But it's not us that we want to reform, it's you. If you want us to stay, we want democracy. That's what we want. I think that's a very easy thing to argue for. And certainly when we're arguing for things, we always seem to do quite well, don't we?
That's a good note in which to end it on then. So if we did get a second referendum, and we could possibly ask for that sort of reform, obviously, as part of the deal, but of course, I don't know if we would manage to get there, obviously, even though someone who enjoys attention, such as Nigel Farage, would actually even want that, even though he's accomplished the dream that UKIP had and were formed for, which is to take Britain out of the EU. And he said, well, actually, still want a second referendum, maybe. So there we go. I was speaking to Jay Martin, 107 stream now. That's what you've been listening to all about. Well, what is this? You've been hearing the word BrExit a lot. Well, at least you can find out now more about exactly what it's all about and how they are doing with it. There you go.
Good stuff.